Unpacking the big Biden-Putin summit, the U.S. is about to get its first new federal holiday in 40 years. And your favorite podcasts are coming to Facebook. Thursday Need to Know. Let's go. Good morning. This is Cheddar's Need to Know podcast for Thursday, June 17th. I'm Jill Wagner with Carlo Versano. Hey, Carlo.
Morning, Wags. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning. All right, let's get to the big news. President Biden and President Putin of Russia ended their first summit in Geneva, expressing respect for one another and a desire for better relations, but little in the way of concrete actions or how they would get there. Biden said he told Putin that the U.S. would respond in a cyber way to any future cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, which he described as off limits. Putin called the discussion productive, but denied being behind any of the cyber attacks and deflected responsibility for Russia's human rights violations by likening his crackdown on dissent to the arrests of rioters at the Capitol. Carlo, that whataboutism, a famous Putin tactic. Although
sure is.
A lot of people do it here in the U.S. too.
Sure, yeah, he's certainly not alone in that.
Infuriatingly so.
Yeah, it really is one of the more annoying tics that people do, and he does it very well, though, I have to say. I think to the extent that there was much news from this, it was what you said about Biden basically saying that cyber attacks are going to see a cyber response. That's sort of what I took away from it. Putin also got very philosophical at one point, saying, quote, "In life, there is no happiness. There's only the specter of happiness." He's right about that.
It's true. According to at least my social media feed, and I feel like that's accurate.
But, you know, the more I think about these, I was watching how this went down yesterday. I was watching the NBC coverage. I just think that these sort of like high stakes bilateral meetings, especially with adversaries, are sort of a mistake. I mean, I was watching NBC. They had this big, they were doing the whole special report coverage, right? They had this big graphic with a countdown clock of the two guys with their profiles staring like ominously at each other. It's just like the whole pomp and circumstance, I think, is really disproportionate to Putin and Russia's actual level of influence on the sort of global stage. I mean, Putin wants to be thought of as sort of like a Joseph Stalin type, but he's really more of a Tony Soprano when you think about it, right? He's manipulative, he's smart as heck, but he's not really a history-changing figure, I would argue. Here's a couple stats that I just pulled. The Russian economy is equivalent to the economy of Spain. Per capita GDP in Russia is about the same as Grenada. Life expectancy is worse in Russia than it is in Rwanda. They have a serious brain drain of talent. They don't allow any immigration. Birth rates are low and going lower. It's basically a failed or failing state. It's not China, right? It's not an actual global superpower adversary that we have to deal with. And I think that all Putin really wants is to be seen on sort of the same playing field as those in the West, which is a point that you made the other day, while also wanting to sort of burn the West down, metaphorically speaking. So I just like, why give him the opportunity? It feels like this was a win just having this thing happen. And I don't really know what purpose it serves U.S. interests.
It's sort of what we said yesterday, that Putin won before it even started. But I don't know. I think that it's of some value, at least speaking face to face is of value. And I definitely am not trying to compare U.S.-Russia relations to Israeli-Palestinian. But I always think about Yitzhak Rabin, who's the former prime minister of Israel, who said, "You don't make peace with your friends." And it's like it points to the value of actually sitting down with someone. I don't know if have you seen Oslo on HBO Max? Or I don't know if you followed.
It's on my list.
It's really good.
Right?
Also, they have just like a documentary about the actual people involved. I almost think that that's better than the play.
It's about the Oslo Peace Accords.
Yeah, the Oslo Peace Accords. And they have, so there's two things to watch. There's like an actual, the real footage of the people who were involved, and then also the play or whatever it is, the dramatization of it. But it lays out, really, you see how talking to somebody who's your quote-unquote enemy, it allows you to forge better understanding, and you see them as a person instead of just like this other thing. The interesting part, though, is that they were doing that totally behind the scenes as kind of like a back channel, which is the opposite of what happened yesterday, which was basically all about the pomp and circumstance. But back to that summit, it was called at the request of Joe Biden, as we mentioned. He laid out the 16 kinds of infrastructure that should be totally off limits when it comes to cyber attacks. Which is just interesting. It's like Putin is basically saying we're not behind the cyber attacks, and Biden's like, well, here's 16 areas that you absolutely cannot touch. The whole thing is sort of ridiculous, but obviously Putin doesn't have to follow it. And I'm not sure if you saw any of the press conferences afterward. That was pretty fascinating. So they had separate.
Biden got real snappy.
Right. So they had separate press conferences because Biden, again, didn't want to have that moment where they were side to side, kind of like how Trump did with Putin in Finland. Biden did get snappy at the end with, I think that was Caitlin Collins, the reporter from CNN, where she was like, why are you so confident that this is going to be successful? And he said, I never said that. I didn't say that I'm confident. I said that, it'll be successful if X, Y, and Z happens. So he was kind of, it sounded like, at the end of his rope. But I don't know if you saw, there was an ABC News reporter, Rachel Scott, kudos to her, who asked Putin, basically straight up, she said to him, all of your political rivals are either dead or in jail. What are you so afraid of? And
great question.
He didn't really answer, at least not directly, and instead tried to talk about the insurrection on January 6th in the U.S. and saying that that's what they're trying to prevent, that they don't want that to happen there. And then someone asked Biden about that answer, and Biden's like, oh, that's so stupid, pretty much. Anyway, it's pretty fascinating stuff. I mean, I don't know if much is going to come of it, but
no, I don't.
Whatever.
I agree with. I want to sort of just quickly change what I said because I agree with what you said. I think we should talk to everybody. I didn't even have a problem when Trump was talking to Kim Jong-un. It's really more of a media criticism, I guess, that I have of just turning this thing into this huge rigmarole, right? When they should absolutely be talking and doing diplomacy, but like the whole countdown to the summit. But the media, we're in sort of, we're in a weird place right now without Trump to kick around.
No, I think you're right. I mean, imagine that they just did this behind the scenes and no one knew about it. I mean, wouldn't it be so much more productive?
Absolutely.
And they would get so much more done without having to worry about optics. Okay, let's talk what's going on in D.C. Congress has approved a bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday commemorating the end of slavery. The House voted 415 to 14 to pass the measure following its passage by unanimous consent in the Senate. President Biden's expected to sign the bill into law. So this creates the first new federal holiday since Martin Luther King Day in 1983. Juneteenth is already a state holiday in Illinois, Maine, Virginia, and Texas, among many others, but now it'll be for everyone. This Saturday is going to mark 156 years since the last slaves were freed in Texas.
I suspect Biden will use Saturday as the day to sign this bill into law, speaking of optics. The point of a federal holiday, when you really think about it, is it's just to make you remember at least once a year why it is that you have the day off or that your school is closed or that the mail didn't come. And I think that this could go a long way in just making people sort of stop to think, even if it's just for a second, about how recent slavery was, right? The scourge of slavery in this country. 156 years, that's nothing. It's really nothing. I mean, most buildings in Europe are older than that. So I think it's really good in that regard. Of course, it's going to eventually get bastardized into like a day for mattress and used car sales, because that's sort of how every American holiday ends up going. But until then, look, this is fantastic. But this did get me thinking about my new a part of my new presidential platform when I eventually run, Jill. This here it is, June 19th through July 4th. Just make it a national holiday. It's 2 weeks, almost exactly, I think. You get 2 weeks off, and we can call it America's Freedom Weeks. How awesome would that be? Be like, Jill, what are you doing for Freedom Weeks this year?
I'll take it. In case you're wondering what Juneteenth actually is, because we say that it marks the end of slavery, it actually marks the date in which the last slaves in Texas were informed that slavery was abolished. Because it's not like right now where you just do a national address on TV or send a tweet out. It's like this was.
It took a while.
Yes. So that if you're just wondering exactly what that is. Okay, let's switch gears here. A common respiratory virus known as RSV that mainly affects kids is circulating fast, especially in the South, and it is uncommon for the summer months. The most likely reason is that, like the flu, RSV was virtually non-existent last year, and it's making an early resurgence now that people are moving around more and no longer wearing masks as often. The symptoms are similar to a bad cold or a flu. The CDC is recommending that people with those symptoms who test negative for COVID also get an RSV test.
If you want to know just how non-existent the flu was last year, I know that we touched on this a couple months ago. It's really remarkable, though. Roughly 200 children died of the flu in 2019. One died in 2020 just because of all the lockdowns, the masks, the social distancing. That stuff really does work in terms of keeping these respiratory viruses at bay. But I mean, my prediction for the fall, I think we're all going to get sick. I think that if not the flu, then we're all getting a nasty cold this year, especially when it starts to get a little cooler out. I mean, when was the last time anybody was sick with something other than COVID, right? Our immunity is virtually nil. I can't even remember the last time I got a cold.
You know what? I got a little bit sick this year just because of my daughter, and I feel like you'll see kids get sick really often. And pre-COVID, I remember she had basically a runny nose and a little bit of a cold for like from November to March, pretty much.
Yeah.
2020, the second we went out to my in-laws and we just huddled and everyone was in quarantine, no colds, no nothing. And then she went back to school and she did get sick this year. We were actually worried. We talked to her doctor. We're like, what is this doing to her immune system that she's going to be not in contact with anyone and not exposed to any germs for basically a year?
Right.
And they're like, don't worry, she'll have plenty of exposure to germs, plenty of time to make up for it. But yeah, I mean, I think that we are going to see, unfortunately, a really kind of nasty flu season and just, I think we might be sick with this type of stuff. No, I think it's going to, unfortunately, these viruses don't go away.
No, it'll be a bad season. Well, I didn't even think about that I have that to look forward to now that I have a baby, of just constant colds. Wah, wah. Oh, well.
Let's talk the economy. The Federal Reserve now saying that it expects to raise interest rates in 2023 instead of 2024. So that was the conventional wisdom here. It's basically an acknowledgement that the economy is recovering quicker than the central bank had predicted just a few months ago, and that rising inflation is threatening to slow that recovery down. Fed Chair Jerome Powell saying the economy is not out of the woods at this point, but that the labor market is looking strong. He also said inflation is rising faster than the Fed expected. The Fed's forecast now calls for 3.4% inflation in 2021, up from the prior estimate of 2.4%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but that actually is quite a lot. And I feel like I have been sounding the alarm on inflation for a while, just because I pay for stuff and exist in this world. And it's real. I mean, like, everything just costs a whole lot more.
No question. There was a column by an economist named Mike Konzal, I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong, yesterday that I thought was really really fascinating. He's basically arguing against the worrying too much about inflation. I'm just going to quote from this column. It was in the New York Times. Quote, "What we should be scared of is missing our greatest opportunity in a generation to use both low-cost debt-financed federal investments in our infrastructure and revenues from taxes on the wealthy to deal with our deepest and long-standing problems: economic stagnation, entrenched inequality, and climate change. The coming years could be remembered as the birth of a dynamic and more egalitarian U.S. economy. We just have to avoid getting spooked by the bumps along the way, manage the boom, don't fight it," end quote. Which is sort of more or less how I feel, and I think we may disagree on this a little bit, which is fine. But I just think that we have like a real opportunity right now on so many different fronts coming out of this pandemic, not just in the economy, but just on like our way of life, rebuilding infrastructure, giving workers more power in the job force, work-life balance. There's so many things that we could really change now, and it'll just be such a tragedy if we don't meet the moment, I think.
I mean, and not just in broad strokes with the government. I think in our personal lives also. I think if we all just go back to what life was like pre-pandemic, I do think we've missed an opportunity to rethink what's important to us and
everything.
And I think just this resistance that you're seeing of workers who are like, we don't want to go back to the office, especially 5 days a week, tells you that maybe there are real changes. Obviously, I have to be in the office 5 days a week, but Who knows? Well, like I said, I think the real test will be a year from now or 2 years from now.
Yeah, the work from home, the people going back to office thing is still, I really have no idea how that's going to shake out, right? Are people going to go back 5 days a week? Is it going to be a hybrid? I mean, they talk about this hybrid model that feels like it's just sort of like something that they say and then it doesn't end up happening. I don't know. I really don't know. And I don't even know what the best option is for, and obviously it's different for every industry. Like you were just saying, you have to be in the office. You're a news anchor. But the fact of the matter is we put on Cheddar. We put on this podcast, the newsletter, the television network from home for an entire year, more or less without fail. Like there's something to that.
I tend to think, though, that I still think something's missing when you're not in the office.
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
Face to face. And the other point that has been made, too, is that we were able to basically do this transition to remote work because we already had familiarity with each other, because we were already, we had background working in the office together. And even it's like why the school year was so much more challenging this year than the last one, because you basically had the whole school year behind you, and then you went remote. So the teachers already had known, March to June of 2020, the teachers already had background with the students and knew them. It's hard to meet kids for the first time or like get ingrained in a culture of something when you're home. But
that's
again,
that's another ball of wax. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I think that the failures when it comes to public schools in this country over the last year, bigger than we yet understand.
Agreed. The fact that the priority was to get businesses open and not schools open is.
I think we're going to look back on that as one of the biggest, just missteps in recent American domestic history.
Totally agreed. Okay, podcasts coming to Facebook starting next week. The company's been telling creators that it plans to launch its podcast platform on June 22nd, giving users a new option to listen to their favorite shows. There is something unique about Facebook's service compared to others like Apple, Spotify, or Google. So listeners will eventually be able to cut clips of an episode, to share, similar to how Twitch lets users share clips from their streams. I kind of like this idea.
Jill, I am loath to give Facebook any credit for anything, but I agree with you. I think this is very smart. And it's something, when you think about it, that has really been missing from the podcast space for a long time, right? Because podcasts are great, obviously. I mean, we think so. We've been doing this one for like 2.5 years now. But there's two things I think that are really keeping them from reaching their full potential as sort of like an art form, I guess you would say, or just a form of media. One is discoverability. It's just impossible to find anything anywhere, and the platforms are just so bad. We've talked about it. Spotify's changes have made it completely almost unusable in finding shows. And the other thing is shareability, which is sort of part of the same problem. And this is what Facebook's trying to solve here. People love to share clips online of things that other people say and either add their own insight or just dunk on them. It's sort of what makes social media go around. But when was the last time you saw a podcast clip go viral? It's very rare. And I think this is something that could change that for better or worse. But I think probably for better, especially for maybe smaller shows like us in terms of getting new audience.
You know what? I'm going to just give a shout out to my friend JJ Ramberg, who started an app. It's called Good Pods. And she.
Oh, great. That's a great app. Yeah.
It's a great app. And that's the whole idea behind it, is just the discoverability is so difficult. And this lets you follow certain people and see what they're listening to. And I've discovered some great apps on it some great podcasts on it. Just because you never know what to listen to. I feel like I listen to my same few podcasts every day, and if I want anything different, I'd love to see what Carlo Versano is listening to in his free time.
Oh yeah, I think we're listening to probably some of the same podcasts. But the other thing is, it's just like you don't. Maybe there's a part of a show, like a 10-minute part of a show that you want to watch, that you want to listen to, but you don't have time to listen. I get really anxious because when I have like a bunch of stuff in like the queue, I'm like, when am I going to knock these out? I don't have like 2 hours to just walk around listening to pods anymore.
That's why you got to listen to them at like 1.5 speed.
I have a friend that does that, and he does it with audiobooks, and he sleeps with his ear pods in, listening to audiobooks on two times the speed. I'm like, dude, that is not working. There's no way.
You're not absorbing that.
You're not absorbing any of that.
This is, by the way, the best time of year if you are an NBA fan, but the playoffs are a bit of a mess at the moment. Clippers superstar Kawhi Leonard had to sit out last night's win. He has an ACL injury, and he could be done actually for the rest of the postseason. And this followed news that Chris Paul of the Suns was out indefinitely after testing positive for COVID, putting Phoenix at a disadvantage heading into the Western Conference Finals.
Yeah, in the East, it's not much better. The Nets have an injured Kyrie Irving, a recovering James Harden. The Sixers' Joel Embiid has been playing through a meniscus tear for the last couple of weeks. LeBron James expressing many NBA fans' frustration yesterday with just the level of injuries in the league. And he blamed the front office for rushing to start the season so soon after last year's bubble. He's been saying that all year, by the way, and it looks like he was a little bit prophetic. But that said, the Players Union agreed to play the season as it is so that they didn't have to take a pay cut, right? So I wouldn't exactly feel bad for these guys, but it is true that if you watch some of these games, these players are banged up.
There's also a question now about pro athletes and their vaccination status. So we don't know if Chris Paul was vaccinated or not. So certainly, we're not going to pick on him, but a lot of players from the NHL to the NBA to the NFL have been very coy when asked about their vaccine status, including LeBron for that matter.
It's remarkable, really, when you think about it. LeBron especially, I mean, he's such a leader, in not even just sports, but in the culture. And to not come out more strongly for the vaccines really knocked him down a peg in my book. But the thing with players and vaccines, it doesn't make any sense to me, right? An athlete's body is their temple. It's also just why you get paid, how you make millions of dollars. Like, why wouldn't you do everything in your power to keep it safe? I just don't get that. I never will.
Word is that in terms of the Olympic athletes, because we know that the Tokyo Games are fast approaching, that about 80% are now fully vaccinated.
Good. Yeah. Oh, man, they're really going to do these Olympics, aren't they?
It's happening. All right, that is what you need to know for Thursday, June 17th.
Have a good one, guys.